Man, oh man, we were talking about those Florida State games in the 90s. Incredible. Unbelievable. Bowden and Spurrier. But you know, Bowden, he went up against Snellenberger, Jimmy Johnson, Dennis Erickson. And as we mentioned earlier in our next guest, who knows a lot more than I do about it, Bobby Bowden was a guy who scheduled games on the road against Nebraska, LSU, Pitt. And Pitt was good, by the way, back then under Majors and Sherrill. I know, nobody watches Pitt football now. But my point is, then they were ripping off 10 and 11 wins, and he just went everywhere. And went to Auburn. I mean, Pat Dye was loaded in the 80s. People don't realize this. Auburn was the team in the 80s in the SEC. It was not Bama. It wasn't Florida because Spurrier wasn't there yet. I know Georgia grabbed a title, but do you realize that was the only title in the 80s? You know, Auburn came up short a couple of times. Bama was trying to find their way. LSU was out in no man's land, right? And Georgia was just Georgiaing, other than Herschel. It's just the way it was. Auburn was the team in the 80s. So, anyway, Bobby Bowden passed away over the weekend. Legendary coach, built it from nothing. Perfect time to bring on, well, basically a historian, but also an insider of college football with over 25 years in with ESPN. He is Brad Edwards on the Modelo guest line. Brad, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Bo. You just reminded me of a trivial matter that I think would be of interest to a lot of people in your audience, which is that they're not going to be interested in it for this reason, because it was the first Mississippi State football game I ever attended. Nobody cares about that. But which game I think will be interesting. The first Mississippi State game that I ever went to was in 1978. It was homecoming, I believe, and they had scheduled Florida State. So this was Bobby Bowden's third year at FSU, and Mississippi State beat them 50-something, I think, to 20-something. Like it was a blowout. And it was one of those, like, you look back on it a few years later, and you're like, wow, how did Mississippi State do that? Like, because typical, State at that time, it was an average team. It was, there wasn't anything special about them. But, man, on that day, they put it on a Bobby Bowden Florida State team. So, yeah, go look it up, 1978. I don't know what the exact score was, but that was the first Mississippi State football game that I attended. And I had no idea that I was watching an absolute legend in the making on the opposite sideline, but everyone in the stadium was.
It was all downhill from there for MSU football. But anyway, Brad Edwards on the Out of Bounds show.
For Florida State football.
No, not for FSU.
It was all the way up at that point.
All right, we could go, down so many different lanes here, but you had an opportunity to interview and spend time with him during your time with ESPN. What was it? Here's what I've been reading, and I think that you're going to confirm this, but you read guys who covered him and how engaging he was and always open to visiting with the media. What was it like to sit down and interview him, and how was he in that environment, Brad?
Yeah, so when you meet him the first time, you're just wondering, is he going to be like I've always seen him on TV? Because for me, I don't know how many different people I was able to interview during all my years with ESPN, and a lot of them, very successful coaches and players, some of them who were millionaires. And yet the majority of them, for me talking to them, it was just a job. The ones that I got excited about were the ones that I had watched when I was simply a fan like everyone else. Like when I was a teenager, and I just watched college football on TV and loved it. And Bobby Bowden was one of those guys. Like I had watched him, back when I was at JA. I was watching Bobby Bowden on TV, and I loved those teams. And so it was exciting. The first time that I interviewed him, unfortunately, was his, I guess that was either the last or second to last game that he ever coached. It was 2009 at Florida. So it was Tim Tebow's final home game is the reason we were there. But it ended up being Bobby Bowden's final Florida game for sure, if not his final game overall. He might have coached a bowl game after that. And so he was at the very tail end of his career, obviously, not as successful the last few seasons as he had been earlier. And to be quite honest, I was expecting him to be a little slow, see him a little detached. But, and I was surprised by how sharp he was. But at the same time, he was every bit just the gentle, grandfatherly type that you always imagined him to be from seeing him on TV. And all coaches aren't like that. I mean, some of them in person are exactly what you see everywhere else, and there's some others that have a different personality when the cameras aren't rolling. But Bowden was just, it made me smile just sitting there chatting with him. It's like, this is him. This is the guy, And then, I had an opportunity later on after he had retired to sit down with him in the studio at ESPN and talk to him for, I don't know, about 30 minutes. And that was even more fun because we weren't talking about a game he was about to play. We were really talking about, his career. And, we were able to get into a conversation about the state of Florida, kind of taking off in the 80s and stuff like that. And it was just a lot of fun because he was just such a nice guy and was happy to answer all these questions. And he was one of those guys that was always going to give you a long answer. It was never going to be short. And he was just so honest, and unfortunately, Bo, I think it's kind of the end of an era, that he was one of the final guys from that era where they actually trusted the media. And they would say what they felt without this fear that someone's going to try to use it against them. And I know all media members aren't that way. In fact, it might even, be a minority of media members who are that way. But there are enough out there that are looking for a headline that every coach is right to be very guarded about what he says in front of the media. And it wasn't always that way. And Bobby Bowden was one of those guys who, if he had been as open these days, or if anyone was as open these days as Bowden was, during his career, they probably would have had a much shorter career than he did. But he was awesome, and it was a lot of fun to talk to him.
All right. So as someone who was in the National College Football world and ESPN for 25 years, what do you agree, Brad, that Seminoles Gators was the rivalry in the 90s? Because I can just remember the lead up to that in the 90s, one when I was in college, right afterwards. Just the way I know Bowden got Spurrier more than Spurrier got Bowden, but I felt like there was so much on the line every year when they played the last game of the season. And it was almost like a college football playoff game before we even knew anything about the playoffs.
Yeah. So I think there was kind of a transition from the biggest game in the country every year being Florida State, Miami, to it becoming Florida State, Florida.
Yeah.
That in the late 80s really started. 87 is the first big one that I remember, the Miami Florida State game. And obviously all the way through, I mean, at least 92, if not up to 94, those games were huge, Miami, Florida State. But you're right. Once Spurrier got it going at Florida, then all of a sudden, FSU has those two huge in-state games on its schedule, and Florida basically started to rise at the same time as Miami began to fall. And so it was kind of like a passing of the baton from one to the other, but Florida State was the constant. And, the thing is, I don't know that there were ever any Florida games that were as memorable as the biggest Florida State Miami games were, because you had the wide right back-to-back years, 91, 92.
Brutal.
That just had huge national title implications, and of course Bowden was on the wrong end of both of those, and many others in that series. Miami was, kind of like the hurdle that he just struggled to get over so often with his very best teams. Now, I mean, obviously that 94 Florida State game, the 31 all tie, that was a great game and very memorable, but I'm trying to remember off the top of my head whether either team was a legit national title threat at that point. I think both of them already had a blemish coming into that game. And, that was a year that Nebraska and Penn State both went undefeated. So I'm not sure the implications were as big, but I mean, it was amazing. You just think about it. I know most people in the audience are not old enough to remember this, but it's crazy to think that those three Florida schools were all basically nobodies within the grand scheme of college football, nationally. And then, in a very short amount of time, all three of them rose up and just became national powers. And they just had these slugfests, just head to head. And it was just so much fun to watch. And like you said, before there was an official national championship game where you knew you were going to get 1 versus 2 at the end of the year, there were a lot of seasons where, that game, whether it was, Miami FSU or Florida FSU, was more anticipated than maybe even the bowl game that was ultimately going to decide the title.
Brad Edwards on the Modelo guest line talking Bobby Bowden. You're listening to ESPN 105.9 The Zone. Can you imagine if we would have had a college football playoff? Bowden finished 14 straight seasons in the top 5. Brad?
I have said this on many occasions, and one time I said it to Mark Richt, and he just smiled because Mark Richt was the offensive coordinator on those teams. And what I had said to him is if there had been a 4-team playoff back then, Florida State would probably have more than the 2 national titles they do, because there were so many times that they lost to Miami kind of middle of the season. And then by the time it ended, it felt like Florida State was the best team. But, they had that loss that they couldn't get over. And so who knows? I mean, maybe one of the ones they won, they don't win if there's a playoff. We'll never know. But to me, they have always been the team or that program during that time, that 14-year stretch. And you've probably already talked about this, but, they had from 1987 through 2000, 14 consecutive years, they finished top 4. Finished top 4 in the AP poll. I don't think anyone's going to – I mean, look, Alabama has some pretty amazing things they've accomplished under Saban, but that's one that they're not going to do. They're not going to have 14 straight years finishing in the top 4, which Florida State did in that span. And so, I mean, almost all of those years they would have been in the 4-team playoff. And I have to believe he would have won more than 2 national titles if the playoff had been in existence back then.
Yeah. And talk about, Brad, we both grew up with 3 yards in a cloud of dust. And talk about how Bowden this was unheard of really east of the Mississippi River. LaVell Edwards and some of the teams out west, Washington and Warren Moon, Fouts and Oregon, they were willing to open it up and throw it around. But not here for the most part. Talk about how Bowden was willing to open it up on the offensive side of the football long before what you see today.
Yeah, and especially before the SEC had really embraced it. Because for the SEC, it really started with Spurrier. But yeah, Florida State and maybe not quite to the same extent Miami did it in the mid to late 80s, really started throwing the ball. And they took advantage of the athletes that they have. And what's crazy about it is that it really has taken quite a while for all of college football to get to the point where it's generally understood now that the passing game is more dangerous than the running game. Like you're just flat out going to make more big plays. You're going to average more yards per play on pass attempts than you are on rushing attempts. And yet, for whatever reason, you remember the old cliche was always, when you throw the ball, there are 3 things that can happen and 2 of them are bad.
Yeah.
Well, the same thing is true for a running play. I mean, you can gain a lot of yards, you can gain nothing, or you can fumble. Like,
right.
I mean, but for whatever reason, everyone always felt like it was safer. It was a more conservative, safe thing to do was to run the ball. But when you're recruiting the state of Florida like they were at the level they were, they and Miami, and you've got the players at wide receiver, you'd be stupid not to throw the ball more often. And so, yeah, they were doing that. And the crazy thing is Florida State, I don't know where you could find it online to look at it, but they had a stretch where I don't know how many starters in a row were 2-year starters. He basically had that thing staggered where he would have a guy become the starter as a junior, would start again as a senior, and then the next year he would be replaced by a junior who would start for 2 years, who would be replaced by someone else who would start for 2 years. And I think that was part of why that program was so consistent during that 14-year stretch, is because, they're never throwing a freshman out there. In fact, I think what ended the whole thing is when they did throw a freshman out there, Chris Ricks in 2001. But yeah, however he managed to do that with the quarterback, but he always had guys who were mature, had composure, they knew the system, and they were prolific, and it was so much fun to watch them, and like you said earlier, just no fear of anyone as far as scheduling. They weren't scheduling to try to become bowl eligible. They were out there trying to make a statement and get noticed by the voters. And I remember a lot of big non-conference games they would play. I remember one year, I think when I was in college, they went up to Michigan. And I want to say it was a top 5 matchup by the rankings, and they just absolutely de-pants Michigan right there in the big house. And it was one of those games like over at halftime, and you're just like, wow. Like, and you could see, I know it's one of those things where the narrative kind of hung around for much longer than it actually was true about the
Big Ten,
the difference in speed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the Big Ten not having speed. But in certain games like that, this is where it started. Like games like that where you could see the difference in the speed between a Florida State or a Miami and some of the elite teams in the Big Ten. And as those teams began to recruit better, certainly by the time you got to the 2000s, like Ohio State in the 2000s has had as much speed as anybody. But that narrative had just kind of lingered because of games like that in the 90s when teams like Florida State would just take it to Michigan.
And as great as Bowden was, Brad, you can see the drop-off when Rick left to go to Georgia.
Rick and Chuck Amato on defense both left at the same time. Amato became the head coach at NC State. And, losing those two guys, there was a hit there. And at the same time, Bowden, I think it coincided with Bowden, getting to a point where he had started to delegate a lot more to his assistants. He was not as hands-on as he had been. And once he got to that point where he started delegating and then 2 of his most important assistants left, the program really suffered. And, I wish I knew more about, how hands-on he was when he built the program, because I know at the very end, he really was much more of a figurehead. He's just the guy who does the interviews, and you kind of got the feeling everyone else was doing the coaching, but there's no way you could be as good as they were for as long as they were without him having a good football mind and knowing what he was doing. The question is like, at what point did he flip that switch and go off? But it was somewhere around the time, that Rick and Amato left. And, and that was the end of it. But yeah, he had so many assistants though that stayed with him for long periods of time. And that's just something that you rarely see these days in college football.
Yeah, it is. Brad Edwards on the Modelo guest line. 25 years with ESPN's college football team, and some great insight on Bobby Bowden, who passed away over the weekend. I've only got a couple of minutes here, Brad. I want to switch gears real quick. We can't do a deep dive, but we're going to have plenty of time to do it at some point. But just share with our listeners your new project, your book on Alabama football and Nick Saban.
Yeah, so it's really on the Saban era more than it is on Saban himself. So I wrote a book. It's called Dynasty by the Numbers, and I really just dig into what Alabama has done under Saban, and it really kind of focuses on two things. One is not that Alabama has been the best team in college football over the last 12 or 13 years. I think that's obvious to anyone. But it's how much better they've been than everyone else in the sport over that span. And I tell that story through numbers, not writing about numbers, but, data visualization, like charts and graphs and things like that really just make it evident from a quick glance. Here's Alabama, here's everybody else. And so that's part of it. And then all of it together tells a second story, which is that everything Alabama has done over that span makes it the greatest run of 10 or more years that any team has ever had in college football history. I mean, there aren't many stretches from anyone that can rival this as far as the number of wins and championships over a 12 to 13 year span. But when you start bringing in all the other things, like where they've been ranked in the polls, looking at what they've done in the NFL draft, I know recruiting has not been a thing for that long as far as being ratings and stuff, but you look at the recruiting ratings, you look at some of the numbers they've put up on offense, on defense, some of the individual honors that they've won. All of it together, there's not a run like this in the history of the sport that can be put up against this one. And so that's really what the point of the book is. And, Alabama fans understandably have become so spoiled by what they've seen that they expect it now year after year. And I don't think that they appreciate exactly what it is they're seeing and how unbelievable it is. And whether it's when they read this book for the first time or whether it's, 10 years from now when they take it off the shelf, I'm hoping that they'll be able to look at this and just say, wow, that was pretty amazing. Because it is. And I think that those of us who have a much bigger perspective on college football understand we're never going to see this again, not just from Alabama, but from anyone for as long as we live. You're not going to see anyone be able to sustain this type of greatness for this long when everything in the sport is kind of designed to keep it from happening.
Great stuff. Brad Edwards on the Out of Bounds show. And his new book will be out, Dynasty by the Numbers, on the Saban era at the university. End of this week. Dynasty by the Numbers on the Saban era at the University of Alabama. Thanks, Brad. Look forward to catching up next week.
You got it, Bo. Take care.
Brad Edwards on the Modelo guest line. The show is brought to you by Went McGee, the Mortgage Man. MortgageManMS.com. Went McGee, MortgageManMS.com. Show is also presented by the Charbroiled Oysters at Drago's Seafood Restaurant and Oyster Bar, right there on the property of the Hilton Jackson on County Line Road. If you missed any of the show, hit Apple Podcast, search the Out of Bounds Show. See you tomorrow.